On Memorial Day at my lakeside home in Virginia, surrounded by dozens of guests, I never imagined my own family would betray me. My son-in-law's father suddenly shoved me onto the wooden deck and shouted, "He attacked me!" Flat on my back, with a dislocated shoulder, barely able to move, I watched my son-in-law draw closer and say with ice in his voice, "Apologize to my father. Now." I said nothing, but what my granddaughters said next shifted everything and drove me to expose a truth no one saw coming. Welcome to Honor Revenge Stories, where we sit with the stories that don't let go, the ones about family betrayal and what it takes to finally stand up for the people you love. If stories like this one speak to you, I hope you'll stay close and follow along for more. Before we go any further, is this your first time here, or have you been with us through a few of these already? Drop a word in the comments and let me know. One more thing, before we begin, some details in this story have been shaped for the purposes of telling it. Any resemblance to specific real people or events is coincidental. It's the truth inside the story that matters. A brief note before we begin: this story includes fictional elements added for narrative purposes. Any resemblance to real names or places is coincidental, but every lesson it carries, I mean it completely. I never could have guessed that the single most gorgeous afternoon of that summer would haunt me for the rest of my days. Memorial Day. Sunday in the lake looked like something off a postcard. Glassy silver bright under the Virginia sky, the kind of day where Morel would have slipped her arm through mine and murmured, "Roy, this is it. This is exactly it." Smoke from the grill below drifted upward, braiding itself into the warm, pine-scented air coming off the water. Behind me, somewhere in the press of 30 or 40 guests' bottles clinked, and laughter rose, and plates moved from hand to hand, the whole scene carrying on as though nothing in the world could possibly go wrong. I stood at the railing holding a glass of water, watching afternoon light play across the lake, and allowed myself just briefly to think of her. Morel would have loved every bit of this. I never heard Rayford Greer approach. The first thing I registered was both of his hands flat against my upper back, driving forward, sudden and deliberate, and without a trace of hesitation. No stumble, no misread of the space. This was a shove with his whole body behind it, the kind a man only throws when the decision was already made, long before he crossed that deck. My glass flew and burst against the railing. I pitched forward, twisted sideways, and hit the boards. The pain that exploded through my right shoulder wasn't the kind that creeps in. It detonated the way a door sounds when it's blown off its frame. I threw out my arm to stop the fall and understood at once that I'd made it worse. Something in the joint had moved in a direction it was never built to move. After that, every breath felt like inhaling ground glass. I stayed on my side on those scorching boards, jaw locked, willing myself not to shift, because any motion fed the fire. That was when Rayford Greer began his performance. He came at me, everybody saw it. This man came right at me. His voice filled the deck loud enough to silence every pocket of conversation at once. He tried to knock me down. I want witnesses. Did everybody see what he just did? Footsteps rushed in, voices stacked on top of each other. The whole party collapsed into a single moment of held breath, the way all sound vanishes when the air goes out of a room. People pressed to the deck's edges and looked down. What they saw was an old man on the boards and Rayford standing over it, all face-flushed, scarlet arms, thrown wide, the very picture of a man who had been done wrong. Not one of them had seen him do it. Sheldon appeared at my side, dropping into a crouch, but he never reached for me. No hand on my arm, no word about whether I was injured. None of the things a man does when his wife's father is bleeding on the ground in front of him. He brought his face close to mine, and when he spoke, his voice was barely above a breath, flat and cool as a stone pulled from a river. "Apologize to my father, right now. Do that, and I'll help you get inside." The shoulder pain was extraordinary, the kind that shrinks your whole world down to a single point. My field of vision had tunneled at the edges. My right arm had stopped feeling like part of me, but I caught every syllable he said. I turned my head, looking past Sheldon, scanning the faces, until I found the one I was after. Petra was standing roughly 10 feet away. Both arms were folded across her chest, her own fingers digging into her forearms, knuckles pale. Her eyes met mine. I held the look. 1 second, 2, 5. Then her gaze slid down to the deck boards. In that moment, the shoulder stopped being what hurt most. Soft hands found my face before I understood what was happening, small palms warm, pressing carefully against my jaw. I turned toward them. Daisy. 6 years old, pigtails unraveling a smear of ketchup on her chin. She had worked her way through a forest of adult legs to reach me, and now she was on her knees on those baking boards, her little hands framing my face, her brow pulled tight with the kind of worry no child that young should ever have to carry. "Ow, Grandpa Dunbar, does it hurt? Tell me where it hurts." Something gave way behind my sternum. I lifted my good hand and laid it over one of hers. When I spoke, my voice held steadier than I had any right to expect. "I'm all right, sweetheart. You just stay right here with me." Above us, Rayford was still running his show for the crowd. "Somebody needs to make this man apologize. My son needs to handle his family." Sheldon rose to his feet. His expression had locked into something hard and flat, the look of a man deciding how to dispose of an inconvenience. "This is your last chance. Say what needs to be said, and we move on." I looked at my granddaughter's face, this 6-year-old who had elbowed past a wall of adults to kneel beside me on a hot deck. Something settled in my chest, not anger, not grief, certainty. I pressed my good hand to the boards. I began to push inch by inch, grinding my teeth against what it cost until I was sitting. Then I didn't stop. My legs trembled and my shoulder burned white, but I got myself upright under my own power. I didn't reach for Sheldon's hand. I didn't glance at Rayford. I faced the crowd. I'm not apologizing to anyone. Measured, unhurried, loud enough to carry to every corner of that deck. But I do have a few things I'd like to say, right here, in front of everybody. Sheldon's face went the color of old ash. There are moments when the truth requires no volume. It only needs to be spoken plainly with enough witnesses present, so no one in that crowd can later claim they were unaware. I stood there, right arm useless at my side, shoulder still screaming. And underneath all the noise, I found something I hadn't touched in years, a stillness deep and unshakable. 30, maybe 40 people had gone completely quiet. Cups hung in midair. Sentences had died unfinished. Every eye was fixed on the old man to see what came next. I let my gaze move slowly around the deck. Over the coolers, the folding chairs, the paper lanterns Morel had chosen 18 years ago, still hanging between the posts. I'd never had the heart to take them down. Does anyone here know who owns this lake house? Silence. A few sidelong glances. A single cough. That boat tied at the dock. I went on my voice, even each word given its own space to land. Who wrote that check? What about all this outdoor furniture? Whose account did that come from? The deck repairs, 2 summers back, the boathouse roof, 17 years of property taxes. Does anyone standing at this party today have any idea whose name has been on all of it? The quiet grew heavier. Rayford's color had shifted past red into something harder to name. He pushed forward, chin leading. "You're making a scene over nothing. Every person here watched you lose your footing and come at me." I turned and met his eyes. "Rayford, I'm going to ask you to stop talking now." There was something in the way I said it. Maybe it was precisely because I wasn't shouting. Fury announces itself. I wasn't announcing anything. Then a voice from my left, thick and certain. "The old man's stirring up trouble at a family party. Someone ought to put a stop to this." Arlo Greer, Sheldon's older brother, built wider across the shoulders, the sort of man who has always confused being loud with being right. Since the moment I hit those boards, he'd been the most vocal presence in that crowd, and at no point had he thought to check whether I was conscious. I turned to face him. "Arlo," I said, "you've been standing here defending your father for the last 10 minutes. That's a loyal thing to do." A pause. "You borrowed $14,000 from me in the spring of 2021. You told me your wife couldn't know, so you signed a promissory note instead. I have that note in a lockbox at my house with your signature on it, and you haven't made a single payment." The color emptied out of Arlo's face almost faster than I could track it. His mouth fell open and stayed there, nothing coming out. A low murmur moved through the crowd in a slow wave. Sheldon stepped toward me, his voice compressed into something that was equal parts threat and desperation. "This is not the time or the place to—" Sheldon." I looked at my son-in-law squarely. This man who had called me Mr. Dunbar for 12 years, who had accepted my money, my professional connections, the run of this property for years on end, and who, when I lay hurt on the ground, had leaned in to extract an apology rather than call for help. "I have been very patient with you. That patience is finished." Rayford tried once more, his voice climbing, casting outward toward the crowd. "There's no proof of anything. He's an old man making things up because he's embarrassed he fell. I didn't fall." The words came from the far edge of the deck, low but clear. Harlan Croft moved out from the cluster of people near the railing, a tall, spare man in his 60s. Morell's age, someone who had held the deed to the property across the cove longer than Sheldon had been alive. He was holding his phone up in front of him, screen angled toward the nearest onlookers. "I was out on the water with my telephoto lens," Harlan said. "I was shooting the herons on the south bank. What happened on this deck, I caught it by accident." He tilted the screen so the people closest could see. "That is not a man who lost his balance." The crowd leaned in. I watched the expression shift face by face, the way a building goes dark floor by floor after closing. Rayford looked at the phone. His shoulders dropped half an inch, then a little more. The flush drained from his face and left behind something grayish and unsteady. And for the first time in all the years I had known him, he appeared to have no idea what to say. I didn't give him time to locate the words. I scanned the deck one last time until I spotted Petra. She hadn't moved from where she'd been standing, still gripping her own arms, but now her eyes were glistening, and she was looking directly at me, rather than at the floor. I crossed to her close enough to speak without being heard by anyone around us. "Your mother would have been very sad today," I said quietly. Then I turned and found Clem Purcell at the edge of the crowd. He already had his keys in hand. I walked off that deck without looking back. The emergency room had the smell they all share, antiseptic recycled air, and a particular brand of hush found only in places where people are working hard to hold themselves together. Clem had driven me down the mountain and asked nothing he didn't need to ask. That was the nature of Clem Purcell. He had been my closest friend for 31 years, and he knew that the most valuable thing you can offer a man in a bad moment is a steady hand on the wheel and silence the rest of the way. The attending physician was a brisk, precise woman who examined my shoulder with the confidence of someone who had done it 1,000 times and told me what I'd already worked out for myself: traumatic dislocation. The joint had been driven clean out of its socket by a high-velocity impact. She used the word impact the way physicians do factually without inflection. But I understood what she wasn't saying. This was not the result of an old man losing his footing. She stepped out to arrange imaging. For a moment, the room held only me and Clem, and the steady rhythm of a monitor humming somewhere behind the curtain beside us. Clem sat in the plastic chair next to the bed, elbows on his knees, turning his truck keys over and over in his hands. He glanced up. "You doing okay, Roy?" "I've had better Sundays," I said. He let out something that was almost a laugh. "You want me to call anybody?" I thought about it. The list of people I actually wanted to call was short, and the name at the top belonged to someone 2 years gone. "No," I said. "Not yet." The doctor returned, confirmed what the imaging showed, and asked the question I hadn't known I was bracing for. "Is there any family here with you tonight, Mr. Dunbar?" I looked around the curtained bay. Clem caught my eye and gave me a slow, quiet nod. "My friend is here," I said. The doctor nodded and moved on. Clem looked back down at his keys and said nothing, which was exactly the right call. There was nothing to say. 4 hours. That was what it took. I know, because I tracked the clock on the wall above the supply cabinet the way you only watch a clock when you're not sure what you're waiting for, but you're waiting for something. The procedure was behind me. My shoulder sat locked in a sling, and the pain had changed register, no longer sharp now, deep and settled, the kind that checks in with you each time you shift your weight. My phone had made no sound since we left the lake house. At 7 minutes past 10:00 it rang. "Petra." I accepted the call and brought the phone to my ear. "Dad." Her voice fractured on the first syllable, splitting the way dry wood does. "Dad, are you okay? How bad is it? Why didn't anyone call me? I just found out you went to the hospital, and I didn't know." "Where are you right now, Petra?" A pause. When she spoke again, her voice had dropped. "I'm at the lake house," and I studied the white ceiling above me. "And Sheldon told you not to come." It wasn't a question. The small sound she made was answer enough anyway. Something caught between a breath and a word that dissolved before it could form. "He said you tripped," she whispered. "He said you didn't need anyone there, that you were fine, that making a big deal out of it would only—" Her voice gave out. "Dad, I'm so sorry. I should have—" "It's all right," I said. And I meant that not because things were all right, but because I had no intention of spending what remained of my strength being angry at Petra tonight. "Go check on Daisy. Make sure she's settled. We'll talk tomorrow." "Dad." "Tomorrow, Petra." I ended the call. Clem looked at me. I looked at the wall. At 11:03 the phone rang again, Petra's number, but when I answered, the voice that came through was not hers. It was small, careful, just barely above a whisper. "Grandpa Dunbar." "Daisy." I pressed the phone tight against my ear. Are you still at the hospital? My throat closed faster than I expected. Hey there, sweetheart. I'm here. Where are you? In my room. I locked the door like you always say. A pause. Grandpa Dunbar Daddy and Grandpa Rayford are fighting really loud downstairs. I could hear it all the way up here. I got scared, so I took Mommy's phone from her purse. I pushed myself upright despite the flare of pain that answered from my shoulder. You did exactly the right thing calling me. Now listen, you stay in that room, you keep that door locked, and you don't come out until your mama comes to get you herself. You understand me? Yes, sir. A pause smaller than the last one. Grandpa Dunbar, why doesn't Daddy like you? The question landed somewhere I had no armor. I pressed my free hand flat to the mattress and breathed slowly through my nose before I answered. I don't know, sweetheart, I said. But I'll tell you what I do know. I'm going to stay right here on this phone until you fall asleep. So you just close your eyes and let me hear you breathe all right. Okay, she whispered. I sat in that hospital room with the phone against my ear and listened to my granddaughter's breathing slow and find its rhythm a child 60 miles away in a locked room in the dark. Clem had stepped out to give me privacy. The only sounds were the monitor beyond the next curtain and that soft, even exhale pulling towards sleep. When I was certain she was out, I set the phone on the bed and sat with my hands folded in my lap. Through the window, the Virginia night pressed in completely dark. Clem drove me home just before midnight. He offered to stay. I told him to go get some rest. We both understood I wouldn't be sleeping. I sat at the kitchen table without turning on the lamp for a long time. The house had the particular stillness of a place that has gone quiet for too long, not peaceful, just empty. Morel used to say the house only felt like a home when there were at least 2 people in it. She was right about most things. I made a pot of coffee I never drank, and I sat there in the dark and let my mind go back. The first time I ever laid eyes on Rayford Greer, he came through my front door with his son beside him. Sheldon was 23, clean-cut, decent-looking, the kind of young man who understood how to present himself. He had asked to come meet Petra's family in the old-fashioned way formally, and I had respected that. What I hadn't been prepared for was the father. Rayford walked into my living room, and his eyes didn't come to me first. They moved around the room, across the bookshelves, up to the crown molding, over to the bay window, looking out on the back garden. He took his time about it. Then he settled into the chair I'd offered, crossed one ankle over his knee, and turned a smile on me that felt less like warmth and more like a calculation. "You've got a beautiful home, Mr. Dunbar," he said. "Thank you," I said. From the armchair across the room, Morel caught my eye. The briefest exchange, half a second, no more. But after 30 years of marriage, I could read that look the way other men read a headline. I see it too. That was our signal, the one we'd built without ever sitting down, to name it the small, wordless exchange that carried everything. I should have paid it closer attention. Sheldon had been well-mannered through the whole visit. He answered my questions squarely, shook my hand with conviction, thanked Morel for the coffee. And when they left, Morel stood at the kitchen sink, watching their car clear the driveway, and said very quietly, "Roy, something's not right about the father." "He was fine," I said. "A little rough around the edges, but fine." She turned from the window and fixed me with those steady dark eyes of hers. "I'm not talking about his manners." I let it go. I was practiced at letting things go in those days. I thought that made me even-tempered. I thought it was a strength. A year later, Sheldon needed money. He was launching a company, logistics consulting. He said a genuine opportunity, but he needed capital to get it moving. He came to us directly, and I respected the directness even then. Morel and I talked it over at that same kitchen table on a late Tuesday night, keeping our voices down so Petra wouldn't catch it from upstairs. "We could sell the small house on Keswick Lane," Morel said. She folded her hands on the table and held my gaze. "The rental income is good, but Petra needs this more right now." "That's 40 years of equities," I said. "It's also our daughter's future." She reached across and covered my hands with hers. Her palms were warm the way they always were. "We can rebuild equity, Roy. We can't rebuild family." So we sold. We handed Sheldon a check at closing, and he thanked us and gripped my hand and looked me in the eye and said, "I won't forget this, Mr. Dunbar." Mr. Dunbar. That was the whole of it. Not once, not through 12 years of Sunday dinners and Christmases and the birth of his own daughter, did that man call me anything but Mr. Dunbar. I had persuaded myself it was simply his way. Formal, a little starched. Morel never persuaded herself of any such thing. "Len," she said to me once, maybe 2 years into the marriage, "have you noticed that he never stays longer than he has to? He comes, he eats, he leaves. He doesn't ask you anything about yourself. He doesn't remember things you've told him. Some people are just private, I said. She looked at me the way she did when she had decided not to push. Not because she agreed, but because she could see I wasn't ready to receive it. I sat at that kitchen table in the small hours of that Monday morning and understood with complete clarity that my wife had been trying to hand me something for over a decade, and I had patted her hand and steered the conversation elsewhere every single time. The last year of her life, Morel had taken to writing things down. She kept a yellow legal pad on the nightstand, and when sleep wouldn't come, she'd sit up and write by the glow of the small lamp. I never asked what she put in it. I told myself it was hers, that it was private. What I really meant was that I was afraid to find out. I pushed back from the kitchen table and walked down the hall to our bedroom. I opened the nightstand drawer, looking for her aspirin bottle, the one I still kept there out of habit. My hand found something else. A folded piece of paper tucked beneath the aspirin, torn from a legal pad, the edges ragged, the handwriting unmistakable. Morel's script, slightly unsteady near the end, the letters pressing harder into the page than they once had. I would have recognized it anywhere. The slight lean to the left, the way she bore down on the downstrokes, the letters that crowded together as the line neared its end, as though she was racing to get one more thought in before the margin closed. I carried the paper to the kitchen table and sat under the lamp. She had written it in October of 2021, 4 months before she died, during the second round of treatment, when she was still well enough to sit up at the nightstand and write, but tired enough that some of the letters had begun to wobble. I read it straight through. Then I set it down, pressed both palms flat on the table, and read it again. Bonroy, if there comes a day when our girl doesn't seem to need us anymore, I want you to remember something. She will always need you. She just may not know how to say it, and the people around her may not let her. Don't wait for her to ask. Don't wait until it's easy. You were never a man who waited for easy. Don't start now. I love you more than you have ever understood. And I sat with that for a long time. The kitchen held the kind of early morning quiet that feels different from the quiet of the night, thinner, lighter, as if the dark had been emptied out and nothing had fully filled its place yet. The coffee maker clicked on by itself, the way it always had at 6:15, because Morel had set it that way in 2007, and I had never found any reason to touch it. I got up and poured a cup I didn't need, stood at the counter and thought about what she had known and when she had known it. She had been trying to tell me for years. Not through grand confrontations, Morel wasn't built for those, but in the patient, persistent way she had, of circling back to a thing until I finally engaged with it. A remark at dinner, a question on a Sunday drive, the press of her foot against mine under the table the first night Rayford walked through our door. And I had answered every one of those attempts the same way, gently, reasonably, and completely wrong. She seems happy, Miri. He's not the warmest guy, but he provides for her. Let's not borrow trouble. I set the coffee cup down on the counter harder than I intended. The sound rang through the silent kitchen like a small verdict. She hadn't been borrowing trouble. She had been watching her daughter recede 1 year at a time, asking me to see what she was seeing. And I had been choosing the comfort of willful blindness over the cost of an honest look, because keeping the peace was easier than breaking it. I had watched Petra grow quieter, more guarded. The way she phrased things when Sheldon was in the room, always hedging, always softening, always reading his face before she let a sentence finish. I had told myself it was her settling into herself, the natural carefulness that marriage and responsibility bring. I had told myself a great many things that turned out to be convenient rather than honest. 6 months ago, I had bought Petra a phone, a plain black rectangle from a prepaid carrier, no contract attached. I drove it over to her on a Tuesday afternoon. While Sheldon was at work, held it out to her in my open hand. She looked at the phone, and then she looked at my face, and her eyes went bright and wet in a way that told me she understood exactly why I was giving it to her, without a word needing to pass between us. "It's Sheldon can't know about this," I said. She nodded, pressing her lips together, blinking fast. "Put it in your mother's sewing box," I said. "The green one on the shelf in the closet. He won't go in there." She took it with both hands, careful the way you handle something that could shatter. Then she put her arms around me and pressed her face against my shoulder and held on without making a sound. And I stood there in her front hallway, holding my daughter, and understood in a way I had been sidestepping for a decade exactly what kind of house she was living in. I drove home that afternoon telling myself I was being prudent, prepared, looking ahead. What I was actually doing was conceding something I'd known far longer than I was willing to say aloud, that something in that house was wrong, and I had been waiting for it to correct itself if only I extended enough patience, enough goodwill, enough money, enough silence. Morel had known all of that. She had watched me know it and do nothing, and she had loved me anyway. And she had written it down on a yellow legal pad in the last autumn of her life, just in case I needed to hear it from her one more time. I picked up the note and folded it carefully along its original crease and held it between both palms for a moment. Then I walked back to the bedroom and placed it on top of the nightstand on her side, where I could see it from the doorway. "All right, Morel," I said to the empty room. My voice came out with rough edges. "I hear you." I returned to the kitchen, topped off the coffee cup, and sat back down at the table with a notepad and a pen. It was time to work out what I was going to do about all of it. Morel used to say the most important thing a person could do with any document was file it correctly the first time, because you never knew when you'd need it, and the worst possible moment to discover you'd lost something was the moment it became essential. She had been right about that too. The box was at the back of the hall closet behind the winter coats and a broken umbrella stand I'd been meaning to throw out for years. A plain brown banker's box with a lift-off lid labeled on the side in her handwriting, Lake House Property. Inside were 17 years of paperwork, organized by year and then by category: tax bills, insurance renewals, contractor invoices, utility transfers, dock permits, inspection reports. Every check she had ever written on that property, with the amount, the date, and the payee recorded in the memo line in her neat, compact script. Morel had filed everything correctly the first time. I brought the box to the kitchen table and worked through it, pulling out what I needed and photographing each document with my phone. My shoulder protested every time I reached across the table, a low, grinding ache that kept reminding me none of this had unfolded in a vacuum. I moved through it the way I had moved through everything in my life that mattered, steadily, without hurrying, making sure each step was sound before I committed to the next one. Clem Purcell arrived at 8:30 with 2 coffees from the drive-thru on Covington Road and let himself in with the spare key he'd carried for 15 years. He took one look at the table buried under paper and drew out a chair. "Tell me what you need," he said. "I need you to go back through everything you heard at that party," I said. "Every exchange, every name, anything Rayford or Sheldon or Arlo said within your earshot. Write it all down, as specific as you can get, with times if you can place them." Clem reached into his jacket pocket and unfolded an envelope he had already been writing on. "Already started," he said. "Been up since 5 Ernbro." That was Clem Purcell complete. I called my attorney at 9:00. His name was Alcott, a careful, methodical man who had managed my affairs for 11 years and had no appetite for wasted words. I walked him through what had happened at the lake house, what was on camera, what Harlan Croft had on his phone, and what I had spread across my kitchen table. He listened straight through without interrupting. "I want to send you a power of attorney form today," he said. "Standard authorization. It lets me act on your behalf for the property matters while your shoulder heals. Once I have that in hand, I can begin formally notifying the occupants that the property owner is reasserting exclusive rights." He paused. "The deed has only ever been in your name." "Mine and my late wife's," I said. "She passed in 2022. It transferred solely to me at that point." "Then this is straightforward," he said, in the tone of a man who genuinely meant it. "I'll have the paperwork to you by end of day." I thanked him and ended the call. Clem looked up from his envelope. "Alcott moving on it?" "Moving on it," I confirmed. I picked up the phone again and dialed a number I hadn't used in close to a year. It rang 3 times before a familiar voice answered, slightly gruff, slightly distracted, the voice of a man perpetually in the middle of something else. "Roy Dunbar," Wendell Drummond said. "Been a while." Wendell and I had attended the same church for 20 years before his company relocated him to Richmond. He was a good man, fair direct, someone who had built his reputation by hand and guarded it with both. When Sheldon had been looking for work 12 years ago, I had called Wendell personally and put my own name behind him. That call had landed Sheldon his first real position, and his career had grown from there. "Wendell," I said, "I need about 15 minutes of your honest attention. Something happened this weekend that I think you should know about." A brief pause, the sound of a door closing on his end. "Go ahead, Roy." I told him all of it: the deck, the shoulder, the footage on Harlan Croft's phone, the box of 17 years of receipts on my kitchen table, and the 12 years of Sunday dinners where Sheldon had never once called me anything but Mr. Dunbar. I didn't editorialize. I didn't ask Wendell for anything in particular. I laid the facts out the way Alcott had trained me to think about them plainly in sequence without embellishment. When I finished, Wendell was quiet for a long moment. "Roy," he said finally, "I owe you an apology. You don't owe me anything." "I do." His voice had a tightness I hadn't heard from him before. "I've had concerns about that man for 2 years now. Nothing I could put a name to, nothing I could act on but something. I should have called you." "Wendell, I'm going to pull his contract file today," he said. "That's all I can tell you right now because it's all I know. But Roy, thank you for calling me." I set the phone down and looked at Clem across the table. "Well," Clem said. "Well," I agreed. Outside the kitchen window, the morning had gone bright and hard, the kind of Virginia summer day that made you squint just looking at it. I refilled my coffee, settled back into my chair, and lifted the next stack of invoices. There was still a great deal of paper to get through. I heard the car before I saw it. A smooth, expensive engine pulling into the driveway, the kind of car that gets hand-washed every Saturday and never carries anything in the back seat. I recognized that engine. I had listened to it idle in my driveway through 12 years of holidays, and Sunday visits always a little too clean, always a little too deliberate, the car of a man for whom appearances were a form of discipline. I set down the stack of invoices and looked at Clem across the table. Clem looked back at me over the rim of his coffee cup. "You want me to step out? I want you to go sit in the armchair in the living room," I said, "where he can see you the moment he walks through the door." Something moved in Clem's eyes, not quite a smile, but close enough. He picked up his coffee and his envelope of notes and went to the living room without another word. I stayed at the kitchen table and waited. 3 knocks at the front door, measured unhurried, the kind of knock that was working hard to sound casual. I rose slowly, favoring my bad shoulder, walked to the door and opened it. Sheldon Greer stood on my front porch in a pressed shirt, hands loose at his sides, wearing the expression I could only describe as professionally concerned. It was the face he used at dinner parties when someone brought up something difficult, a carefully calibrated sympathy applied at precisely the right moment. "Mr. Dunbar," he said, "I'm glad you're home. I was hoping we could talk." It was the first time in 12 years he had appeared at my door alone. No Petra, no Daisy, no built-in buffer standing between us. Just Sheldon on my porch with his pressed shirt and his practiced face. "Come in," I said. He stepped into the front hall, and his eyes moved immediately to the living room, where they found Clem settled in the armchair with his coffee cup and his folded envelope, watching him with the particular expression of a man who has absolutely nowhere else to be and no intention of going there. Sheldon's jaw tightened by a fraction. Just a fraction. But I had been watching that jaw for 12 years, and I knew exactly what it meant. "I was hoping we could speak privately," Sheldon said, his voice staying smooth, the effort it cost him just visible enough to notice. "Clem stays," I said. "Sit down, Sheldon." He took his place at the kitchen table, the seat he had occupied through 10 years of Sunday afternoons. Morel's chair sat opposite the one from which he'd always received her food, with a pair of compliments and a plate he never really touched. He pressed his palms flat on the table and met my eyes with that practiced, unreadable steadiness. "I want to apologize for what happened on Sunday," he said. "My father, he's not a patient man, and things got out of hand. I understand you're upset, and I think if we can all just take a step back." "How is your father's shoulder?" I asked. He blinked. "I'm sorry. Your father put me on the ground in front of 40 people on that deck, and your opening move is to have me apologize to him," I said. "So I'll ask again, his shoulder. Does it give him pain? Is he lying awake at night?" Sheldon's hands moved on the table. "Just slightly. I didn't come here to. Daisy rang me at 11 to Worcester Sunday night," I said. "She used the phone I'd given your wife. She'd shut herself in her room because the 2 of you were downstairs carrying on, loud enough to rouse a 6-year-old child. She said she was scared. I let those words occupy the room for a moment. You came here to talk, Sheldon, so let's talk about that." Something fractured in that composed surface, not grief, not remorse, but the rapid, nearly mechanical recalculation of a man who'd just realized the pieces on the board weren't where he'd assumed they were. "I didn't know she called you. Quieter now. Careful. There are a number of things you don't know," I said. "My attorney filed paperwork this morning regarding the lake house property. Formal notice will reach you before the week is out. I also had a conversation with Wendell Drummond yesterday. I watched his face while I said it. He told me to let you know he'd be in touch. Whatever was left of Sheldon's color departed entirely. You called Wendell," It landed flat, all that professional warmth gone from it. Wendell and I go back 20 years, I said. We talk. Sheldon shoved away from the table and got to his feet. The press shirt composure stripped away now, something colder and more truthful taking its place. You're making a serious mistake, he said. You're going to damage relationships that cannot be repaired, and for what? Because my father lost his temper at a party. I kept my eyes on him from where I sat, my voice entirely even. Your father didn't lose his temper, Sheldon. He waited until Clem stepped inside and Harlan looked the other direction, and then he planted both hands between my shoulder blades and shoved with everything he had. That's not temper. That's a choice. Sheldon had nothing to offer in reply. His mouth opened and came up empty. Clem will walk you out, I said. I lifted the stack of invoices and returned my attention to the page I'd left off on. Behind me, I heard Clem put his cup down on the end table and get up from the armchair. I heard Sheldon move through the front hall. I heard the door open and shut. Then Clem came back to the kitchen, pulled out the chair, and picked up his coffee again. Well, he said. He took that better than I expected. He didn't take it well at all, I said. He just ran out of moves. Sheldon had knocked 3 times, measured and unhurried. Rayford Greer used his fist. It arrived at 4:30 on Thursday afternoon, a hard, relentless hammering that shook the door frame and set the small hallway mirror swinging sideways on its hook. I'd been sitting at the kitchen table, and before I'd even crossed the room, I knew from the sound alone everything I needed to know. Clem was behind me in the kitchen. He'd gone home Wednesday evening and shown up again Thursday morning, carrying a change of clothes and a bag of groceries, because that was simply the kind of man Clem Purcell was, and neither of us had ever had to put it into words. He glanced up when the knocking hit, folded his newspaper down the middle, and laid it on the table. I went to the front door and pulled it open. Rayford was on my porch shoulders, set chin forward, wearing the face of a man who'd spent the whole drive over, building up a head of steam he planned to spend. He seemed larger than he had out on the deck, or perhaps the porch made him seem so standing there in my space, which was precisely the effect he was after. We need to talk, he said, not a request. We can talk right here, I said. I held the door where it was and kept my feet planted. His gaze moved past me, swept the interior, then came back to my face, carrying what I'd seen at the party. That brand of contempt men like Rayford cultivate for anyone they've decided won't push back. You went after my son's job, he said. You sent your lawyer after our property. You think you can just reach into our lives and pull out whatever you feel like. Each sentence climbed a notch in volume above the one before it. By the time he finished, he was nearly as loud as he'd been on the deck. You're an old man living alone in a house that's too big for him, and you have no idea who you're dealing with. When I'd opened the door, I'd angled myself just slightly to one side. The small security camera I'd put up in the corner of the porch overhang 18 months ago, after Morrell died, and the empty house started feeling less safe at night, sat positioned directly behind my right shoulder. Its red indicator light pulsed in that slow, even beat it always kept while it was recording. I gave Rayford a moment to run out of breath, then spoke quietly and without hurry. The camera above my right shoulder has been recording since you knocked. Everything you just said is on it. His gaze moved up, landed on the camera. The red light blinked back at him. The change that crossed his face is one I won't forget. Not guilt men like Rayford don't arrive at guilt quickly. It was closer to recalibration, the jolt of discovering that the room he'd walked into bore no resemblance to what he'd prepared for. That doesn't matter, he said, though the volume was gone and the certainty had begun to soften at the edges. I haven't said anything that was... You told me I have no idea who I'm dealing with, I said. You said you could reach into people's lives. You arrived at my home without notice after your son had already been served, with notice that I'm taking legal action over property you've occupied without ownership. In Virginia, a statement of that kind made under those circumstances, directed at someone with an active legal matter against you, has a name. I paused. My attorney will be happy to explain it to yours. Rayford's jaw moved without producing anything. You're going to make this into something it isn't. I'm going to make it into exactly what it is, I said. From somewhere behind me, I heard Clem's chair scrape back from the kitchen table, then his footsteps coming down the hall at an easy, unhurried pace. Deliberate. The sound of a big man making his presence known. He came up on my left side and stood there, arms easy at his sides, face giving away nothing. Rayford looked at Clem, then at me, then at the camera. This isn't over, he said. The bluster had gone out of it. What remained was something smaller and uglier, the sort of words a man reaches for when the entrance he planned has collapsed, and he needs to walk away without it looking like a retreat. "I know it isn't," I said. "I'll be here when it continues." He held my gaze for 3 seconds, then turned, went down the porch steps, and got into his car without a backward glance. I stood and watched it back out of the drive and move off down the street until it disappeared. Clem exhaled slowly beside me. "He's going to do something stupid now." "Probably," I said. "Frightened men usually do. You not worried?" I thought about Morel's note on the nightstand. I thought about Daisy's voice on the phone, Sunday nights small and careful in the dark. I thought about 17 years of invoices in a banker's box and a power of attorney filed with Alcott's office that morning. "I was worried for 12 years, I said. "I'm finished with that." I went back inside, and Clem came in behind me, and I turned the lock on the front door. I knew it was Petra before I even touched the handle, not from the sound of her car. She had always driven quietly, lifting off the gas a full block before she got anywhere. What comes next is the moment I had been dreading, and if I am honest, quietly preparing for. Someone was about to sit across from me and say the things people say when they believe they are still holding all the cards. Before we get there, if you had spent years watching someone you loved slowly disappear inside a life that was never really hers, would you wait for her to ask for help, or would you move first? The habit of a woman who had learned not to announce herself. I knew it was her because it was Friday afternoon, because Sheldon would be at whatever meetings he was still clinging to, while his professional life came undone, and because I had spent 2 days at that kitchen table waiting for my daughter to find her way back to me. She looked as though sleep had been a stranger since Sunday. The corners of her eyes were puffy, and her shoulders held that particular tension of someone who has been keeping themselves upright through sheer will for so long it had started to show. She had on a gray cardigan. I recognized Morel had given it to her 3 Christmases ago. The soft kind, the kind Morel always chose because she said Petra ran cold and needed layers. She stood in my doorway and looked at me, and her chin trembled once before she got it back under control. "Can I come in?" she asked, as though she needed permission to enter the house she'd grown up in. That alone said everything about what 12 years had made of her. "Petra," I said, "you never have to ask me that." She came inside, and I brought her to the kitchen table, her chair, the one with the slight wobble in the right rear leg that I had never fixed because fixing it felt like erasing something. I put the kettle on because Morel always said tea worked better than coffee when someone needed to talk. Then I sat down across from my daughter and waited. She wrapped both hands around the mug when I placed it in front of her, pressing her palms into the ceramic, as if trying to pull the warmth straight out of it. Her knuckles were pale at the edges. "Sheldon told me what happened here," she said. "Both times. He said you were being unreasonable. He said you were trying to pull the family apart because you've been holding a grudge against him for years, and this was just your excuse." "What do you think?" I asked. She looked down at the mug. Her jaw moved. "I think I stood on that deck and watched my father on the ground, and I didn't move." Her voice broke straight down the middle, on that last word splitting like timber under too much weight. "I didn't move, Dad. I just stood there." That word landed somewhere I hadn't braced for. She hadn't called me Dad in longer than I could account for. With Sheldon in the room, it had always been some careful managed formality, the kind of language people fall into when the natural version has been trained out of them. "You were scared," I said. "Yeah, I was scared." She said it the way you say something you're ashamed of, rather than something anyone would find reasonable. I've been scared for a long time, and I kept telling myself it wasn't that bad, that I was reading too much into it, that if I kept things quiet enough, kept everybody settled enough, it would all... She pressed her lips together hard. Her eyes went bright and wet, and she blinked quickly, fighting it back. "Petra," I leaned toward her. "Look at me." She raised her eyes. "Your mother knew," I said. "She knew for years. She tried to tell me, and I didn't hear her the way I should have. That is something I have to carry, not you. Do you understand what I'm saying?" Her face gave way. Not all at once, but in pieces, her brow first, then the corners of her mouth. And then the tears came, and she pushed the back of her hand against her lips. And her shoulders shook with the kind of grief that's been stored too long, the kind that tears at you on the way out. I got up and came around the table, and put my good arm around her and held on. She turned into me and pressed her face against my shirt the way she used to when she was 7 years old and something in the world had hurt her. I rested my chin on her head and let her cry it through. When the worst of it had passed, she pulled back and dried her face on the hem of the cardigan, and I settled back into my seat, and she looked at me with red-rimmed eyes and said, "He hid Mom's journal from me, Dad. I found it when I was going through his filing cabinet looking for property papers. It was in a box at the back buried behind his tax records. 12 years. He had it for 12 years and never said a word." My hand tightened around my mug. I kept my voice steady. "I know. Did you know about the journal? No. I knew Morel had written things down. I didn't know she had sent anything to you." Petra pressed her fingers over her eyes. "She wrote me a letter inside it. She said she was afraid I would forget that I deserved to be loved correctly." Her voice climbed thin and high, and she stopped for a moment, pressing her lips hard together until she'd gotten hold of herself again. "He read it, Dad. He must have read it. And then he put it in a box and locked it away in that filing cabinet." The kitchen held very still around us. Through the window, the afternoon light was going golden, that particular shade that meant the day was tilting toward evening. Morel had loved that light. She used to stop whatever she was doing and simply stand at the window for a moment when it came. "Petra," I said quietly, "I need to ask you something, and I need an honest answer." She wiped her eyes and gave me a small nod. "Are you safe in that house?" She opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. It's not like that. He doesn't." She stopped and drew a breath. "He makes me feel like I'm disappearing," she said at last. "Like each year there's a little less of me than there was the year before. But he's never—" "No, I'm safe." I held her gaze for a long moment, weighing it. Then I nodded. "All right," I said. "Here's what's going to happen. I'm going to give you the name of an attorney, not Alcott, a different one. Someone who handles family law. You're going to call her next week, and whatever you decide to do, I will be standing right behind you. Not out in front making your decisions for you behind you. Do you understand the difference?" She looked at me with those swollen eyes and nodded. Then she reached across the table and covered my hand with hers, and her grip was stronger than I expected. "Dad," she said, "I'm sorry it took me this long. You're here now." I said, "That's what counts." The week after Petra came to see me, the world Sheldon Greer had constructed for himself began coming apart at the seams. Not in any dramatic fashion. Not all at once. The way things actually collapse in real life, quietly by degrees, one supporting beam at a time, until what looks solid from the outside turns out to have been resting on things that were never really his to lean on. Alcott called on Tuesday morning. The formal notification went out yesterday, he said. Certified mail delivered to the lake house property. Mr. Greer has 30 days to vacate and remove personal belongings. The property deed has always been solely in your name, Mr. Dunbar. There's no legal ambiguity here. They have no claim and no grounds for contest. Have they responded? I asked. Their attorney sent a letter this morning, suggesting that your son-in-law's long-term use of the property constituted implied permission of continued occupancy. Alcott's voice carried the particular dry patience of a man who has listened to a great many creative legal arguments over the years. I've seen stronger cases made for considerably less. What does that mean in plain English? It means they have 30 days, he said. I thanked him and set the phone down on the kitchen table. Clem, who had been working through the sports section across from me, looked up. Alcott, 30 days, I said. Clem turned a page. Good. Wendell called Wednesday afternoon, and his voice had the careful, measured quality of a man selecting every word with professional deliberateness. Roy, I want you to know that what I'm about to tell you is a decision I made based on my company's interests and my own reading of the situation. This has nothing to do with any pressure from you or anyone else. I understand, I said. Sheldon Greer's contract comes up for renewal at the end of the month, Wendell said. After looking at his performance record, his conduct history, and some conversations I've had with people on his team over the past 2 years, conversations I should have had, sooner I've decided not to renew. He'll receive formal notification on Friday. The line went quiet for a moment. Outside my kitchen window, a mockingbird was working through its repertoire in the oak tree, cycling through 6 different songs, without pausing. Wendell, I said, I appreciate you telling me. I appreciate you being straight with me. 2 weeks ago, he said. I should have asked better questions a long time back, Roy. That's on me. After I hung up, I sat with that for a while. I had not asked Wendell to do anything. I had told him the truth and let him reach his own conclusions the way I should have done years earlier, instead of quietly standing behind a man I had already started to question. It was Petra who told me what happened when Sheldon got the news. She called Friday evening, her voice low and controlled, the sound of someone picking every word carefully, because they are in a house where walls carry sound. He came home at 2:0, she said. He already knew before he stepped through the door. I could see it in how he walked through it. Are you all right? I asked immediately. I'm fine. She let out a breath. He threw his keys on the counter and looked straight at me and said, Your father did this. Your father pulled strings and got me fired, and you're just going to stand there and let him do this to our family. A pause. Dad Wendell Drummond doesn't pull strings. Everyone in Sheldon's industry knows that. No, I said. He doesn't. I told him that. Her voice leveled slightly the way a voice levels when a person has finally said the frightening thing out loud and the floor held. I said Wendell Drummond has been in business for 30 years and has never once acted on a personal favor. And if your record couldn't survive someone asking honest questions about it, that is not my father's fault. I pressed my palm flat against the kitchen table. My chest had gone tight in a way that had nothing to do with my shoulder. How did he respond to that? He told me to choose, she said. Him or you, pick one. The mockingbird outside had gone quiet somewhere else. The kitchen held still around me. Petra, I told him I'd already chosen, she said. I told him I chose the man who drove himself to the emergency room with a dislocated shoulder rather than let a 6-year-old child watch her grandfather be humiliated. Her voice broke on those last words, but didn't come apart. And then I went upstairs and phoned the attorney you gave me the name of. I have an appointment on Monday. Something loosened in my chest that had been coiled tighter than I'd known. Good, I said. I'm proud of you. Dad. A long pause. Arlo called Sheldon yesterday. Did you know that? No. He said he was done, that he wasn't getting pulled into it anymore. She let out a slow breath. Sheldon asked him why. Arlo said, and I'm quoting exactly, because the man has paperwork, Sheldon. He has paperwork on everything, and he's not afraid to use it. Despite everything, the tightness in my chest, the aching shoulder, the 2 weeks of accumulated weight, I felt something that came very close to a smile. Clem was watching me from across the table, eyebrows up. Arlo backed out, I said. Clem nodded slowly. I had been awake since 4:30. That had become the pattern since Memorial Day, the body holding on until somewhere in the small hours, then giving out and returning me to wakefulness whether I wanted it or not. I lay in the dark with my shoulder aching in its low, steady way, listening to the house settle around me, all the familiar sounds of a structure that has stood for 40 years and learned how to speak to itself. The phone rang at 6:02. I had it off the nightstand before the second ring finished. Petra, Dad. Her voice was different. Not the careful, hedged version I had grown used to hearing from her. The one that always seemed to be leaving itself room to pull back. This was something else. Steadier. More certain of where it stood. I need to tell you something. I sat up and put my feet on the floor. I'm listening. I went into his office last night, she said. After he fell asleep, I needed to find the insurance paperwork for Daisy's school. Physical, and I went into the filing cabinet. He keeps locked. A brief pause. I've had a copy of that key for 3 years. I had it made at the hardware store on Braddock Street when he left his keyring on the counter one morning. I never used it before last night. Petra. There was a box at the back, she said, and her voice tightened for a moment before she brought it back under control. Behind his tax records going back to 2014. A shoebox Dad, brown with a strip of tape on the side, and my mother's name written on it in his handwriting. She stopped. I heard her pull a slow, deliberate breath. He labeled it. He put her name on it and filed it away behind his taxes, like something he had a right to keep. My grip on the phone tightened until the plastic gave a faint creak. There were letters in it. Petra went on. Cards your mother had sent me over the years that I thought had been lost in various moves. A photograph of the 3 of us at the lake house. I was maybe 12. Mom was laughing at something off to the side of the frame. You had your arm around her. I had never seen that photograph before. Her voice went thin for a moment before she pulled it back down. And the journal. The one she wrote during treatment. Did you read it? I read it until 3:00 in the morning, she said. All of it, every page. A long pause. She knew everything, Dad. She put it all down in writing. What she feared, what she hoped for, what she wanted to say to me, and could never find the right moment to say. I heard the sound of Petra pressing her hand against her mouth, holding something back. Then the last entry was 2 weeks before she died. She said she was leaving the journal for me because she wanted me to have her words even after she was gone. She said she had asked Sheldon to give it to me when the moment felt right. The silence that came after had real weight to it. He decided the moment never felt right, I said. For 12 years, Petra said. 12 years, Dad. I got up from the bed and crossed to the window. The street outside was gray and still in the early morning light, the neighborhood not yet stirring, a single lamp burning in the house across the way. Petra, what do you need from me right now? I need you to know that I've made a decision. Her voice had returned to that steadier register, the one that had caught me off guard at the start of the call. I'm calling my attorney at 8:00 when her office opens. She told me at our appointment to contact her the moment I was ready to move forward. I'm ready. A breath. Daisy and I are leaving today. While he's at his meeting this morning, I'm not taking much. Her thing's the box from his filing cabinet, and I need to know if we can come to you. Something in my chest opened so quickly it nearly hurt. You don't need to ask me that either, I said. You know where the spare key is, under the ceramic frog by the back steps, she said, and I heard the faint shape of a smile in it. Mom put it there in 1996 and you've never moved it. It's worked this long, I said. Dad. Her voice softened. I'm sorry it took me this long to get here. You got here, I said. That's the only part that matters. After we hung up, I made coffee and sat at the kitchen table and waited. At 8:15, Petra called back briefly to tell me her attorney had filed for a temporary custody arrangement that morning. A protective measure standard procedure in situations like hers that would establish legal documentation of Daisy's residence while the formal proceedings got underway. The attorney had laid it out plainly. The order was not a judgment, simply a safeguard to ensure neither parent could make unilateral decisions about the child's whereabouts while the case was being established. At 10:40, Sheldon called my number. I let it go to voicemail. The message he left was 4 minutes and 20 seconds long. I did not listen to it. At 2:17 in the afternoon, I heard a car pull into the driveway. I went to the back door and opened it before Petra could knock, and Daisy came through first at a dead run. Pigtails flying, a stuffed bear clutched under one arm, and she hit me at approximately knee height, with enough force that I had to grab the door frame with my good hand. Grandpa Dunbar, she announced into my stomach. We brought 3 bags in a box, and Mommy cried in the car, but she said it was the good kind of crying. There she was, in the doorway. Petra, 2 canvas bags slung over one shoulder, the shoebox riding under her other arm, eyes still raw at the edges, but her jaw set and level. Get in here, I said. Both of you? Daisy had firm views on the question of where Sergeant the Bear was going to sleep. It was not a small matter. It required a thorough tour of the guest room, a comparative assessment of pillow softness, a back and forth about the nightlight, and ultimately a ruling handed down, with the gravity of someone accustomed to being obeyed, that Sergeant would occupy the left side of the pillow, that being the side nearest the door, on account of Sergeant's preference for keeping watch. A child had not been in this house since Petra was 17. I had let myself forget what that was like, how a small person doesn't fill a room with noise so much as with a kind of charge and aliveness that reaches into every corner. 6 years old, and she had already decided the house was something to be explored rather than endured. Petra stood watching from the guest room doorway, while her daughter arranged Sergeant with great precision, and on her face was the look of a person who has been pushing against something enormous for so long that simply being allowed to stand still felt foreign. The set of her shoulders was looser than it had been when she came through the back door. Her hands, which I could almost always count on finding clasped in her lap or gripped around a mug, hung open at her sides. Once the bear situation had been resolved to Daisy's satisfaction, she hopped down from the bed, caught my hand in both of hers, and steered me toward the kitchen like she already knew the layout. I'm hungry, she announced. Can we have tomato soup? Whatever you'd like, I told her. Petra trailed us in and settled into her seat at the kitchen table, the one with the wobble in the right rear leg, and I got the stove going, and for a stretch the kitchen was quiet except for the sounds of cooking, and Daisy providing Sergeant with a running commentary on everything visible from her chair. That's an owl clock, Daisy said, pointing at the ceramic clock on the wall that Morel had bought at a craft fair in Staunton in 2005. Grandpa Dunbar, why does your owl have a clock in its stomach? Because your grandmother thought it was funny, I said. Daisy thought about this. Was she funny? She was the funniest person I ever knew, I said. She was also the smartest and the most stubborn, and if you'd had the chance to meet her, she would have made you laugh. Daisy swiveled toward the framed photograph on the kitchen shelf, Morel and me at the lake house, 1986. Morel pointing at something off to one side and laughing hard at it. Is that her? That's her. Daisy gave the photograph the same grave, unhurried study children reserve for things that have earned their full attention. She has nice eyes, she said at last. My throat went tight. She did, I said. She really did. I brought the food to the table and set a bowl in front of Daisy, who went at it with the single-minded focus of a child who has navigated a very hard day mostly by skipping lunch. Petra curled both hands around the mug of tea I put down for her and held my gaze from across the table. Sheldon called me 6 times this afternoon, she said. I know. He rang me as well. I didn't pick up. She said it clean. No apology attached, none of the faint defensive coloring that used to work into her voice when she explained falling short of something Sheldon expected from her. She stated it the way you'd note the temperature outside. Good, I said. She rotated the mug between her palms. He left a voicemail. My attorney phoned after she'd heard it. She said it was actually helpful for our case. I let that sit without asking for more. That was Petra's business, hers, and her attorney's. Daisy surfaced from her soup long enough to fix me with a kind of direct look that belongs almost exclusively to young children. Grandpa Dunbar, are we staying here for a while? I glanced at Petra. Petra looked back at me. Something moved between us that words would have only gotten in the way of. 30-some years of being father and daughter condensed into a single breath at a kitchen table. For as long as you want to, I told Daisy. Daisy gave a businesslike nod and went back to her soup. Then she set her spoon down and studied me with those eyes. Morel's eyes, the resemblance close enough to catch me off guard when I least expected it. And she said, "Can I call you Grandpa instead of Grandpa Dunbar?" Grandpa Dunbar is a lot of words. Something shifted in my chest that I didn't quite have a name for. Grandpa is just fine, I said. It came out a little unsteady. Daisy broke into one of those big whole-face smiles that children produce when they have fixed something, picked up her spoon, and went right on eating. Petra's hand came across the table and settled over mine. The grip was warm and sure, the grip of the 9-year-old who used to hold my hand on the walk into church every Sunday. Thank you, Dad, she said quietly. You don't have to keep saying that, I told her. I know. One squeeze, then she let go. I want to. Through the kitchen window, the evening arrived the way good evenings do without hurrying. The light above the neighbor's roof gone to amber, the oak tree pulling long shadows all the way across the yard. Morel's owl clock showed 6:45 on the kitchen wall. Sergeant the Bear sat propped against the salt shaker at his post. For the first time since Memorial Day, the house felt like something other than Petra and Daisy were under by 9:60. The house told me so, that shift in the texture of quiet that only settles in when everyone beneath a roof has finally released the day. I'd looked in on Daisy once, pausing in the guest room doorway, long enough to see that Sergeant was still holding his position on the left side of the pillow. And that Daisy was sleeping the way children do, when something in them truly believes they're safe on her back, both arms thrown wide, nothing guarded in her face at all. I stayed in that doorway longer than I planned to. Then I made my way back to the kitchen, switched on the small lamp above the stove, because it threw a softer light than the overhead, and sat down with Morel's note. I'd read those lines enough times in the past 2 weeks to say them by heart. But reading them now at this table, on this particular night, with my daughter and granddaughter asleep down the hall for the very first time, was a different thing entirely. The words carried more weight than they had before. Their meaning had shifted just enough to matter. Don't wait for her to ask. Don't wait until it's easy. You were never a man who waited for easy. Don't start now. I put the note down. I pressed both hands flat on the table surface and looked at the wood grain beneath them. The thing I had been walking around for 2 weeks, the truth I'd sensed without going directly at it, landed on me. Then Morel hadn't written that note only with Petra in mind. She had written it about me, about what she knew I could do, and about what she knew I was just as capable of not doing, because 34 years had given her a clear-eyed picture of both, and she'd loved me too honestly to pretend she hadn't. I had convinced myself I was being patient. I had called it keeping the peace. I had watched Petra grow quieter and smaller and more guarded over the years, and told myself that was a private thing, a matter between a husband and wife, not somewhere a father belongs. What I had really been doing was the identical thing I watched Petra do on that deck on Memorial Day, holding perfectly still, while something that was not right continued in front of me. Because to move would have meant owning the fact that I'd seen it all along and done nothing. 12 years of staying still. The coffee at my elbow had gone cold. I nudged it away and sat quietly with my hands in my lap. and made myself go back to the particular moments I had looked the other way. The Christmas when Sheldon answered a question someone had put to Petra, fluently without a pause, as though her own answer was beside the point. The birthday dinner, where he had mentioned casually, and in front of others, that Petra had put on weight since their wedding. The phone calls where I had noticed she always spoke to me differently with Sheldon nearby, shorter, more measured, one part of her attention always angled toward the door. I had registered all of it. I had filed every last piece of it in the part of my mind labeled "not my concern" and turned back to whatever was in front of me. Morel had not done that. Morel had kept watching, and she had kept speaking carefully, patiently, choosing the angles she knew I could receive. And I had responded by covering her hand with mine and suggesting she might be seeing more than was there. She had looked back at me with those steady dark eyes and decided not to press because she knew I wasn't ready to hear it. She had been right about that as well. The phone buzzed against the table beside me. I looked down at the screen. "Clem," I hit accept. "It's past 10 o'clock, I said. "I know what time it is," Clem said. "I've been sitting here thinking about you." "Are you holding up all right? Petra and Daisy are here," I said. A pause, then quietly, "Good." "That's real good, Roy." "Yeah," I said. "It is." Another pause. The kind Clem and I had been exchanging for 31 years, long enough that neither of us felt any pull to fill the silence, and long enough that neither of us needed to. Then Clem said, "You've been sitting at that table thinking too hard, haven't you?" Not a question. "Clem," I said, "I've been doing the same thing she did, Petra. All this time, I've sat here thinking she should have stood up, sooner, said something, sooner walked out, sooner. And I've been doing the exact same thing." My voice came out rough, like something kept too long, somewhere dry. Morel told me more times than I can count. And I stood there, and I nodded, and said everything I was supposed to say, and I didn't do a thing. For 12 years. Clem went quiet for a good stretch. When he spoke, his voice was measured and direct, the way it got when he had something real to say and wanted it to reach. "Roy, you listening to me?" "I'm listening." "What you just said, that took something. Saying it to yourself, being honest about it, that's not nothing." He let a beat pass. "Morel knew you. She knew you'd find your way there. That's why she wrote the note." I pressed the back of my hand against my mouth. My eyes were burning the way they had not burned since the night we put Morel in the ground. That dry, tight, specific ache that builds behind the eyes when something too large is working its way out through too small an opening. "I should have done better by both of them," I said. My voice had dropped to nearly nothing. Morel deserved a man who listened the first time, and Petra deserved a father who didn't need 12 years to start acting like one. Roy. Clem's voice was firm, but carried no edge. "You're doing it now. That matters." I sat there in the soft light of the stove lamp, while the house was still around me, my daughter and granddaughter asleep down the hall, and I pressed my free hand flat on the table where Morel had sat for 30 years, and I let the burning behind my eyes do what it had been waiting to do. 2 years since we buried her, and I had not permitted myself this, not once, not fully, because I had told myself I needed to stay upright, stay useful, stay functional. I was through telling myself that. Clem didn't say a word. He stayed on the line. After a while, I cleared my throat and told him I was all right. "I know you are," he said. "Get some sleep, Roy. Tomorrow's a new day." I set the phone down. I folded Morel's note along its original crease and held it between both hands for a moment. Then I stood, switched off the stove lamp, and made my way down the dark hall and stopped once more in the guest room doorway. Daisy had turned onto her side. Sargent had toppled off the pillow, but was still on the bed, which I suspected would be deemed an acceptable arrangement by the relevant authorities. I went to my room, lay down in the dark, and closed my eyes. For the first time in a very long time, sleep came without a fight. Clem arrived at 7:45 with a bag of biscuits from the place on Millborough Pike that Morel had always said made the best ones in the county. He had not once in 31 years of friendship shown up at my door before 8:00 without a reason. He put the bag on the kitchen table, poured himself coffee from the pot I'd already brewed, and settled across from me, with the look of a man who has been carrying something for a while and has decided this is the morning to set it down. Daisy was still asleep. Petra had materialized briefly in the kitchen doorway, in her robe taken in the scene, accepted a biscuit from Clem, and retreated with her coffee to the guest room. The particular tact of a woman who understood that 2 old men at the table needed the kitchen to themselves for a spell. I waited until the guest room door pulled softly shut. "All right," I said. "What is it?" Clem turned his coffee cup slowly on the table. He studied it for a moment, then looked up. "There's something I've been sitting on since Memorial Day," he said. "I held off because I wasn't certain you were in a place to take it in. But after last night," he stopped, then started again. "After last night, I think you need to hear it. Tell me," he put his cup down. "You remember Arlo was drinking pretty steady from around noon that day. By the time things went sideways on the deck, he'd had, I'd say, 4 or 5 beers, maybe more. He was over by the cooler talking to one of the cousins, and I was passing by on my way inside when I caught what he was saying." Clem's voice took on that careful, measured quality it got when he was trying to relay something word for word. He said, and I'm giving you his words, as close as I've got them. He said, "You know, the old man's property is the whole reason my brother ever went after that girl. Rayford picked her out before Sheldon even knew her name. Said she was the only child, said the father had assets. Told Sheldon just be patient and do it right." The kitchen went completely still. I looked at the bag of biscuits on the table as the cup between my hands at the morning light coming flat and bright through the window off the neighbor's roof. "Rayford picked her out," I said. "That's what Arlo said." I set my cup down with care. I was not surprised, and the fact that I wasn't surprised was itself something I needed to sit with. Every piece had been there. I had simply declined to put them together because putting them together would have meant accepting that I had delivered my daughter to a man who had been pointed at her. "I remember the first time he came to this house," I said. "Rayford. He came with Sheldon when Sheldon came to ask about Petra. I thought it was odd a grown man hauling his father along to ask a girl's family if he could court her. But Sheldon was polite, and the visit went smoothly. Afterward, I convinced myself it was simply how their family did things." "And Rayford Clem?" asked. He sat in my living room and looked at everything in it. I can see it as clearly as if it had happened this morning. That slow, deliberate sweep of Rayford's gaze across my bookshelves, the artwork on the walls, the bay window, the back garden. And then he said, "You have a beautiful home, Mr. Dunbar." And I thanked him. I paused. He wasn't paying me a compliment. He was taking stock. Clem watched me from across the table. Morel knew I said. She pressed her foot against mine under the table all the way through that visit. That was our signal, her way of telling me there was something I needed to look at. And afterward, I told her Rayford was a bit rough around the edges, but seemed harmless enough. My jaw went tight. She never agreed with me on that. She just stopped pushing because she understood I wasn't ready. "What do you want to do with this?" Clem asked. I took a long moment with that. Outside, a car moved past on the street. The refrigerator hummed in its low, steady way. Down the hall, I heard Daisy's voice talking to Sergeant, most likely delivering her morning briefing. "I need to tell Petra," I said. "You sure about that?" "She deserves to know the truth about how it started," I said. 12 years of her life went into a marriage that had been engineered around her, shaped and arranged without her ever being let in on it. Whatever she's carrying now because of that, she has a right to the full picture. Clem gave a single nod. "What are you going to tell her?" "Same way Morel handled the hard conversations with me," I said. "No cushioning, no preamble, just the truth." I rang Petra at 10:30, once Daisy had eaten and been pointed toward the backyard with sidewalk chalk and a standing order to produce something worth admiring. Petra took the seat across from me at the kitchen table, coffee cradled in both hands, gaze level, and waiting. I walked her through all of it. Everything Clem had passed along from Arlo's remarks at the cooler, what I could still recall about Rayford's first appearance at the house, Myrell's foot, finding mine under the table and holding it there. When I reached the end, Petra didn't speak right away. She dropped her eyes to her mug, then brought them back up to me. "Did you know?" she said, "before any of this came out." "Had you guessed?" I didn't look away. "Something felt off," I said. I couldn't have named it. But I made a choice not to press because pressing would have meant giving up the easy story I was telling myself. I let that sit. "The fault in that is mine, Petra, not yours. That's what I need you to take away from this." Her eyes filled. She drew her lips tight, held the tension there, then released it in one slow exhale. "I think part of me understood too," she said, her voice dropping. "Not what Arlo said to Clem, nothing that specific. But there was always something beneath the surface, a wrongness I couldn't account for a reason. The whole thing never felt quite like I imagined it was meant to." She studied her own fingers. "I couldn't figure out what to do with that, so I folded it up and set it aside." "I know that move," I said. "Made it plenty of times myself." She raised her head. Whatever had made her eyes wet had hardened into resolve. "We're finished with that," she said, not asking. Finished, I said back. From out in the yard, Daisy's voice came over the fence. She had completed her masterpiece, and we were required to come see it immediately. This was urgent. It was a portrait of Sargent on horseback, and it was without question the finest work she had ever produced. Petra laughed, really laughed. Nothing held back the sound coming from some honest place well below the surface, and shoved her chair away from the table. I went after her into the morning, and the day spread itself out ahead of us, plain and unhurried, and for a stretch of time that was exactly what we needed. The trip up ran 2 hours and 40 minutes. I had covered that road dozens of times, Morel beside me in those early years, reading passages aloud from whatever novel she was halfway through, then Petra Small in the back seat asking every 20 minutes whether we were close. And then, for the better part of recent years, just me and the road, and the settled ease of a man whose body has memorized a route so thoroughly his hands steer the bends before his mind registers them. That Saturday morning in late August, I made the drive alone. Windows open, the Virginia air moving through warm and heavy smelling of pine resin and red clay. I pulled over once at a gas station on the far side of Culpeper, picked up a cup of coffee I had no real use for, and spent 10 minutes in the parking lot, staring at the middle distance before I got back behind the wheel. It wasn't fear keeping me in that parking lot. It was the need to know before I set foot on that property that I was returning with clean hands and clear purpose. Not to catalog the wreckage, not to relitigate the past in my own head, but to reclaim what had belonged to me before any of this ugliness started. I swung into the gravel lot at 2:30. Late summer had the place looking the same as it always did. Grass grown shaggy along the dock, the south wall of the boathouse crying out for a new coat of paint, a wedge of pine needles banked against the bottom of the deck stairs where no one had thought to sweep. Sheldon's people had removed their things a full 2 weeks ahead of the deadline. Alcott had confirmed it, with the restrained pleasure of someone who had assembled an airtight case and found in the end that the other side simply folded. I sat with my hands still on the wheel. Then I got out, came around the far side of the house, and stepped up onto the deck. The boards underfoot hadn't changed. The railing was as it had always been. Morel's 2 Adirondack chairs, the ones she'd pushed for in 1993, insisting that a lake house without them was only half a lake house, stood where she'd set them that first weekend 3 decades of Virginia, sun and rain having bleached them to a soft silver gray. I crossed to the spot near the far railing, the exact place I'd been standing when Rayford came up at my back. I stopped there, looked down, pressed my right foot against the plank where I'd gone down. The shoulder had come back residual tightness when the cold moved and the doctor had noted, but structurally solid. I tested the rotation slow and deliberate. It held. From my shirt pocket I took out Morel's photograph. Before leaving I'd slipped it out of its frame on the kitchen shelf. The 1986 one Morel caught mid-laugh arm, extended toward something outside the shot, hair falling loose, the lake a sheet of silver at her back. For a long time, I'd kept a copy folded in my wallet, but that version had blurred and softened past recognition. This one held every detail. This one was still her. I settled into her chair. The left one which had always been hers, the afternoon angle being better from that side she'd always maintained, and sat holding the photograph with the water spread out before me. At this hour in this season, the lake did its usual thing. The blue deepened gradually, sunlight skimming the surface at a long, flat angle and fracturing into bright, shifting bands. A great egret was standing in the shallows at the south bank, absolutely motionless, as still as something carved. Morel had a deep fondness for the herons and egrets, the most patient animals on the planet, she'd say, and a standing lesson for anyone willing to stop and watch. I'm back. I said it to the photograph, to the water, to whatever presence Morel had left behind in a place she'd cherished for 30 years. My own voice came back to me without a tremor, which caught me off guard. It took longer than it should have, but I'm back. I let that settle. The egret redistributed its weight by a fraction and locked itself still again. Petra is doing all right, I told her. Better than all right, if I'm honest. She's been sitting down with her attorney every 2 weeks, and the way she's moving through all of it, there's more steadiness in her than I could have managed at that age. She's sleeping through the night again. 3 years she went without that, she told me. I stopped there. You already knew, didn't you? You saw she wasn't sleeping and it worried you sick. And you held it back from me because you knew I'd only make it worse. The water shifted. The egret gave nothing. Daisy calls me Grandpa now, I said. Just Grandpa, plain and simple. She figured Grandpa Dunbar was an awful lot of syllables, and honestly, she's not wrong about that. I looked at Morel's face in the photograph, that wide-open laugh she never seemed to plan. She has your eyes, Miri. I should have said it more plainly more often. She has your exact eyes. Tires on gravel. I didn't move. A door, then footsteps crossing the lot. Climbing the deck stairs, and then Clem rounded the corner, carrying 2 cups poured from the thermos that went everywhere he went, wearing the look of a man who had made a 2-hour drive because someone he cared about had asked him to come. He put 1 cup in my hand and dropped into my chair, mine being free since I'd taken Morel's, and turned his face toward the lake. No traffic to speak of, he offered, though I hadn't asked. Good, I said. He worked at his coffee. I worked at mine. The egret pushed off from the shallows in that great improbable wing beat, slow and vast, and somehow sufficient for a bird that size, and went low across the water before lifting into the trees along the opposite shore and vanishing. You holding up all right out here? Clem asked. Yeah, I said. I really am. He dipped his head unsurprised, then leaned over and lifted Morel's photograph from the chair arm where I'd rested it. He was quiet with it for a while. She would have loved this, he said at last. What you pulled off. Every last piece of it. She would have loved watching you see it through. Something moved in my throat. My eyes went to the water, to the place where the egret had stood. I know, I said. I only wish she'd been here to watch it happen. Clem picked up the photograph from the chair arm, with the care of someone handling what isn't theirs to drop. She watched it, he said. One way or another, Roy. She saw the whole thing. We stayed put as the sun sank below the trees and the lake darkened and the first stars pricked through above the water. 2 old men in 2 weathered chairs, and neither of us had anything left that needed saying. Petra had asked carefully with the particular hesitation of someone still finding her footing in the act of wanting things, whether she and Daisy might come up to the lake house for a weekend before the season turned cold. The way she asked it was the same way she used to ask for things as a little girl. No pushiness, no assumption, just a genuine openness to the possibility that the answer could be no. It took me a beat to understand what I was actually hearing, then another beat to get past the ache that came with understanding it. After that, I told her the lake house belonged to her every bit as much as it did to me, and she had no business asking permission to use it. She went quiet on the line for a moment. Then, okay, Dad, 3 words, but the way she said them told me that truth was going to need some time to take root. We headed up on a Friday evening, and Daisy held forth for the full 2 hours on the agenda she had already assembled in her mind. It covered catching a frog, locating a good flat rock, mastering the art of stone skipping, conducting an experiment on whether fish could detect conversation, and resolving definitively whether the water was cold in the satisfying way or only cold in the miserable way. By the time we rolled into the gravel lot, I had received a thorough briefing. Daisy was out the door before the engine had properly died, heading straight for the dock, with her laces already working loose, shouting back that the water temperature issue could not wait. Petra stood next to the car and took in the lake, the house, the deck. I watched her face move through several things in the space of a few seconds, a tightening at the corners of her eyes that I knew, then a long release of breath, then something that let go and settled, landing somewhere close to peace. You doing okay? I asked. She kept looking at the deck a moment longer. I am, she said. I was braced for it to feel worse coming back. She tilted her head a fraction. Mostly it just feels like the lake house. That's what it is, I said. Daisy was already crouching at the dock's edge with one hand dragging through the water, issuing her findings to the open air. It's cold, she reported. But the good kind, Grandpa. Definitely the good kind. Petra laughed, and whatever tightness had been around her eyes let go completely. The afternoon unfolded the way an afternoon at the lake house is supposed to, unhurried without any particular destination. I settled on the deck with a book that I made modest progress in, because Daisy materialized at my side at regular intervals, with new findings pressing questions and matters she considered too urgent to defer. A flat rock of real potential had been secured. It was her considered opinion that fish could hear human speech but exercised their right to ignore it. A preliminary frog sighting had occurred, described as extremely exciting, with confirmation still pending before sundown. Somewhere in the middle of the afternoon, Petra came out and sat in her mother's chair. No ceremony about it. She simply walked out with 2 glasses of iced tea, left one on the arm of my chair, and settled into the left one herself. She looked at the water, then ran her fingers along the weathered gray wood of the armrest. "Mom sat here," she said, not a question. "Every afternoon she could manage," I said. "She always said the light came from a better angle on that side." Petra studied where the afternoon sun was laying itself across the water and gave a slow nod as though she were storing the information. "She was right," she said. "We watched Daisy make her first attempt at skipping a stone. It went in steep and dropped straight to the bottom, which Daisy immediately declared a practice throw and formally excluded from the record. Dad," Petra said, her eyes still on the water, "I need to ask you something, and I need a straight answer." "Always," I said. "Do you think she was happy?" A pause. Mom, taking everything together. "Do you think her life, was it good?" The question came down over the deck like the slant of afternoon light, quiet and precise. I turned it over, Morel in that very chair mug in hand, watching the herons work the shallows. Morel at the kitchen table on Sunday mornings. Morel at Petra's college graduation, weeping without a trace of embarrassment, saying she couldn't stop, that it was all too much, that everything was too much in the finest possible sense. Morel in those last months bent over her yellow legal pad in the glow of the nightstand lamp, still finding things that seemed worth the trouble of writing down. "She was happy," I said. "She had hard stretches same as anybody. She worried about you far more than she ever showed you. She was frustrated with me more than she let on most days." I paused. "But yes, her life was good. She loved it, Petra, every last bit of it right up to the end." Petra drew her lips in. Her eyes had gone bright. She gave one careful nod, the kind that says, "I'm holding this, and I don't want to spill it." Then Daisy came tearing up the dock shoe's drenched face lit up with something close to glory. "I found a frog," she hollered. "He's over by the big rock, and he's green and very fat, and I named him Wendell." Petra turned and looked at me, one eyebrow climbing. "Wendell Drummond will never know," I said. Petra clapped her hand over her mouth, her shoulders already going. Then she stopped trying to contain it and laughed all the way head back, nothing held in reserve. The sound of it carried out across the water, and the egret on the south bank lifted its head, briefly considered the interruption, and returned to its business. Just before the light went, I showed Daisy the mechanics of skipping a stone. She got it on the third try, 2 clean hops before it went under. The noise she made startled every bird on that stretch of shore. Petra stood at our backs and cheered, like this was the single most consequential event of the calendar year. Maybe it was. The Sunday morning routine had grown up the way good routines tend to, not planned, but accumulated each week, pressing a little more firmly into the week before it, until the whole shape of it simply became how things were. Petra was always up first, and had the coffee going. I'd come out to find 2 full cups already waiting on the counter, which I had told her 3 separate times was unnecessary. She had gone right on doing it anyway. Daisy surfaced somewhere between the two of us, her arrival usually announced by the sound of Sargent hitting the floor as she rolled out of bed and appeared in the kitchen in her pajamas, hair pointing in every direction, with firm convictions about breakfast. This particular Sunday in the first week of December, she wanted pancakes. "Grandpa makes the best pancakes," she informed Petra with the gravity of a person delivering a factual assessment rather than calculated flattery aimed at producing pancakes. "Grandpa's standing right here," I said. "I know," she said. "That's why I said it." Petra put her hand over her mouth. Her shoulders shook. I started on the pancakes while the batter came together. Daisy scaled her chair at the kitchen table. She had claimed the one with a slight wobble in the right rear leg, apparently on the reasoning that unstable chairs had more character than solid ones, and positioned Sargent on the tabletop in front of her, in what she described as ready for breakfast. "Grandpa," she said, watching me at the stove, "what happened to the people who were mean to you?" The question landed with the clean directness Daisy brought to nearly everything, the easy, unguarded curiosity of a child who hadn't yet absorbed the habit of circling around hard subjects before approaching them. I turned the first pancake and worked out how to answer truthfully without handing her more than she was ready to carry. "They're living with the consequences of the choices they made," I said. "That's generally how it goes." Daisy sat with that. "Are they sorry?" "I don't know," I said. "That part's up to them." "Well, are you still mad at them?" I thought about Rayford's face on that porch, the bluster draining out of him the moment he grasped that nothing was going the way he'd arranged it. I thought about Sheldon at my kitchen table, pressed shirt-measured expression, the hairline crack that had opened in his composure when the ground shifted under him. I thought about all those years of Sunday dinners and Christmas mornings and holidays out at the lake house. The whole thing running on a current I had chosen not to follow, back to its source. Not anymore, I said. Staying angry burns through you. I'd rather put that towards something worth having. Daisy gave a satisfied nod and redirected her attention to confirming that Sargent was properly situated for breakfast. Petra looked at me across the rim of her coffee cup. I looked back. Something moved between us that didn't need language, the private shorthand that develops between two people who have passed through the same fire and emerged on the other side still upright. After breakfast, Daisy announced that the small pond 3 blocks from the house required urgent attention. There had been, she said, a credible report of an unusually large turtle, and the matter could not simply be left open. We made the 3-block walk in the December chill, with Daisy positioned between Petra and me, a hand claimed on each side, launching herself forward every 4 or 5 steps, with the total confidence of a child who has no reason to doubt that the hands holding hers will hold. The pond sat quiet in the flat winter light. The bare trees and the pale sky lay reflected across the water's surface, and 2 ducks made their unhurried way along the far bank, indifferent to our presence. Daisy released both our hands and moved straight to the water's edge to begin her survey, working with the focused energy of someone who treats her investigations as serious business. Petra stood next to me, with her hands pushed into her coat pockets, watching her daughter crouch at the bank. Her attorney filed the final paperwork on Tuesday. She said no lead-in. She didn't say whose attorney. We both knew. It'll take time, probably sometime next year, but things are moving. How does that sit with you? I asked. She held off answering, her eyes on the water. Relieved, she said. Mostly that. A little sad, but not the way I thought I'd be sad. Not about him. A pause. About what I believed it was going to be back at the start before I saw it for what it actually was. That's a fair thing to grieve, I said. She nodded. Then her shoulders did that thing, a subtle squaring and almost imperceptible lift that I had been noticing more and more since the summer. A small, unconscious change in how she held herself. But I'm good, Dad. I want you to know that. I'm genuinely good. I know, I said. I can see it. Daisy looked up from the bank. No turtle yet, she reported. But there's a very interesting stick, and I think the ducks are watching me. The ducks are absolutely watching you, Petra said. Good, said Daisy and turned back to the water. I looked out across the pond, the bare trees, the 2 ducks. Daisy hunkered at the water's edge with her coat bunched up around her knees. Petra beside me, shoulders squared, eyes clear. The December air was cold without being brutal. A dog somewhere down the block was barking at something it had decided was a crisis. I thought about Morel the way I thought about her every single day. Not with the closed-throat grief of that first year, but with something quieter and more sustainable, the way you carry a person, once you've made peace with the fact that carrying them is simply woven into how you move through your days now. I thought about what she had written. Don't wait for her to ask. Don't hold out for the easy moment. I hadn't waited, not this time. Grandpa, Daisy's voice rose up from the bank, steady and sure. Come look. I think I found the turtle. I went down to the edge and crouched beside her. She pointed to a place near the base of the reeds where something dark and rounded floated just below the surface, barely there. She was practically trembling with the effort of keeping still enough not to send it away. Her small fingers tight around my sleeve, her whole attention locked on that one spot in the water. You found him? I said quietly. I told you he was there, she whispered, her grip pulled tighter. I told you. I laid my hand over hers, and we kept very still together at the water's edge, watching the turtle that had been there the whole time, waiting for someone willing to be patient enough to see it. Behind us, I heard Petra settle onto the bench at the path's edge. I heard her breathe out long, slow, all the way through. The turtle broke the surface, fixed us with a brief, ancient stare, and slid back down into the dark. Daisy turned to me, with her eyes wide and bright. Did you see? I saw, I said. She threw both arms around my neck with the full weight of a 6-year-old who has just witnessed something extraordinary and needs the person nearest to her to absorb the magnitude of it. I held on. Looking back at all of it now, I understand things I couldn't see clearly for 12 years. If you stayed with me all the way to this pond, to that turtle, to Daisy's arms around my neck, thank you. That means something to me. I won't pretend this was a clean story. It cost years. It cost the comfortable version of things I had told myself for too long. What it gave back was harder to name. But I believe God has a way of returning what was taken from us, not always the way we planned, but in the form we actually needed. For those of us in this second half of life, and I know many of you understand this, the weight of a long regret is real. So, is the quiet power of finally setting it down. Here is what I'd pass on to anyone carrying something similar. If something feels wrong beneath the surface, don't choose comfort over clarity. The truth you avoid today becomes the weight you carry for years. If the people who wronged you overplay their hand, let the consequences do the work. You don't have to destroy anyone, just stop protecting them. And if someone you love is disappearing inside a life that isn't right for them, move toward them. Don't wait until it's easy, because it will never be easy. This is a family revenge story in the truest sense, not about settling scores, but about a father who finally showed up in the way his daughter needed, and a granddaughter who reminded him what any of it was actually for. If you are in the adults 50-plus chapter of your life and you recognize any piece of this, I hope it gave you something useful to hold. Leave a thought in the comments. I read them. If this story is one someone in your life needs to hear, share it with them quietly. And if you haven't yet followed Honor Revenge Stories, now is a good time. Thank you for being here, take good care of yourself, and I'll see you in the next one.